Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on suffrage, prohibition, and Niagara pressure in progressive America. The core question is this: which claims on citizenship moved Washington fastest between 1900 and 1920, and which claims were left waiting outside the constitutional door, even after years of pressure? The core competency is to compare the victories and the setbacks faced by progressive reform efforts, such as the women's suffrage movement, the prohibitionist movement, and the Niagara movement.
Which claims on citizenship moved Washington fastest between 1900 and 1920, and which claims were left waiting outside the constitutional door even after years of pressure. Three reform movements asked the federal government to define citizenship more sharply. Women's suffrage organizers demanded a constitutional guarantee that sex could no longer bar voting. Temperance reformers demanded a constitutional ban on the liquor trade. Black activists in the Niagara movement demanded equal protection, voting rights, and educational opportunity in a nation still organized around segregation, disfranchisement, and racial violence. The timing exposed the hierarchy of response. Congress proposed the 18th Amendment in 1917 and the 19th Amendment in 1919, and the states ratified them in 1919 and 1920. By then, Niagara activists had already spent years demanding anti-lynching protection, voting rights enforcement, and federal action under the 14th and 15th Amendments without comparable results. White reform coalitions proved strong enough to regulate alcohol and widen the electorate for women while leaving Jim Crow largely intact. These campaigns moved through institutions rather than through sentiment alone. The Anti-Saloon League used district pressure, pastors, donors, and vote counting to shape Congress. NASA tracked legislators, state campaigns, publicity, and ratification maps, while Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party escalated pressure through picketing and wartime confrontation. Niagara activists relied on pamphlets, speeches, black newspapers, and the organizational carryover that helped build the NAACP after 1909. Reform was therefore never just about ideals. It was about which coalition could turn moral urgency into federal action first. The suffrage movement entered the 20th century after decades of organizing by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and many state-level campaigners. Western victories gave the movement its strongest evidence. Wyoming had enfranchised women in territorial days and carried that practice into statehood in 1890. Colorado followed in 1893, Utah in 1896, and Idaho in 1896. These Western precedents let suffragists argue from operating examples rather than from theory alone. Women voted, held local office, joined school board politics, and participated in municipal reform campaigns long before the federal amendment passed. Two rival strategies grew from that experience. Carrie Chapman Catt, leading NASA, refined what became known as the winning plan. It combined state campaigns where success seemed achievable with a coordinated federal amendment drive once enough states had demonstrated momentum. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, first through the Congressional Union and later through the National Woman's Party, pressed a more confrontational approach focused almost entirely on a federal amendment. The split reflected different calculations about pressure. Catt emphasized legislative count, alliance management, and broad respectability. Paul emphasized spectacle, picketing, arrest, and the public cost of delay. Their competition sharpened the national campaign. Suffrage politics also carried sectional and racial tension. Southern white suffragists often argued that enfranchising white women would strengthen white supremacy by increasing the white electorate. Black club women and anti-lynching activists such as Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells rejected that logic and insisted that citizenship could not be divided cleanly by race and sex. Their presence exposed a contradiction inside the Reform Coalition. A movement seeking universal voting rights still tolerated segregation in marches, conventions, and local organizing when white leaders judged those compromises useful for ratification arithmetic. Prohibition grew out of a longer temperance tradition rooted in evangelical Protestantism, middle-class reform, and women's activism against saloon culture. The Women's Christian Temperance Union under Frances Willard linked alcohol to domestic violence, wage loss, child neglect, and neighborhood disorder. The Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893 and led nationally by Wayne Wheeler, became the most efficient political arm of Prohibition. Wheeler specialized in pressure politics rather than broad moral sermonizing alone. He identified pivotal legislative districts, graded candidates, mobilized church networks, and punished wavering office holders. By the 1910s, dry counties and dry states already existed across large sections of the South and Midwest, proving that temperance reform could move from persuasion to law. That state-by-state advance created a ready-made ratification map when the amendment reached the states. Kansas had entered the Union dry in 1881. Maine had a long Prohibition history. And Southern legislatures from Georgia to North Carolina had already tightened local option and statewide restrictions before 1917. Dry organizers worked through county sheriffs, local prosecutors, church conventions, and referendum drives, building a paper trail of petitions, voter rolls, and legislative pledges. Prohibition therefore approached Congress with a tested administrative base rather than with aspiration alone. The Niagara movement emerged in a harsher political landscape. Booker T. Washington's 1895 Atlanta Exposition Address had urged black advancement through industrial education, economic self-help, and tactical accommodation to segregation. W.E.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, and other critics regarded that approach as a concession to permanent second-class citizenship. In 1905, after white-owned hotels refused to host them in the United States, 29 black activists met on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls and issued the Niagara Declaration of Principles. They demanded manhood suffrage, equal treatment before the law, equal educational opportunity, and an end to segregation and racial violence. Their demands stood against the full machinery of Jim Crow: poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, white primaries, segregated schools, and routine lynching. Suffrage organizers turned urgency into public drama in March 1913, one day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, when a massive suffrage parade moved down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. Alice Paul helped stage the procession, and the hostile crowd response became national news. Women marchers were harassed, police protection failed, and congressional hearings followed. The event exposed the cost of treating suffrage as a secondary concern. Over the next several years, the National Woman's Party picketed the White House, carried banners accusing Wilson of hypocrisy, and endured arrests at the Occoquan workhouse. Forced feeding of jailed hunger strikers in 1917 deepened public sympathy and gave the federal amendment campaign a sharper edge. Carrie Chapman Catt worked the institutional side with equal intensity. The winning plan coordinated state referenda, legislative lobbying, and careful pressure on national party leaders. Wartime politics gave her a stronger argument. During World War I, suffragists tied voting rights to women's war service in nursing, industrial labor, bond drives, food administration, and Red Cross work. Wilson, initially lukewarm, endorsed the amendment as a war measure in 1918, arguing that women had made the war effort impossible to ignore. The House passed the amendment in January 1918, but the Senate failed to reach the required two-thirds. A renewed push produced congressional approval in June 1919, and ratification turned into a state-by-state contest ending in Tennessee in August 1920, where Harry Burns' vote made Tennessee the decisive 36th state. Prohibition activists also used wartime conditions to their advantage. Anti-German sentiment damaged the brewing industry, since major brewers such as Anheuser-Busch and Pabst could be depicted as unpatriotic or foreign. Grain conservation arguments strengthened the dry cause, and federal wartime restrictions reduced alcohol production before national prohibition formally arrived. Congress proposed the 18th Amendment in December 1917, and the states ratified it in January 1919. The amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The Volstead Act of October 1919 then defined intoxicating liquor as beverages containing more than 0.5% alcohol and established the enforcement system. Treasury Department agents, federal courts, customs officers, and local police all became part of a costly administrative campaign against a deeply rooted trade. Niagara activists faced a different scale of resistance. Their organization was smaller, poorer, and more vulnerable than NASA or the Anti-Saloon League. Du Bois used writing, speaking, and editorial work to compensate for that weakness. Trotter brought relentless public challenge to accommodationist leadership. Ida B. Wells, though not formally a Niagara founder, remained essential to the broader anti-lynching and voting rights struggle that gave Niagara's program its urgency. Their pressure helped prepare the ground for the NAACP after the Springfield, Illinois race riot of 1908 dramatized that racial violence was a national crisis rather than a Southern exception. Through the crisis, litigation campaigns, and anti-lynching agitation, the NAACP carried forward Niagara's insistence that constitutional citizenship had to include Black Americans in fact as well as theory.
Ratification politics in 1919 and 1920 exposed the machinery behind suffrage victory with unusual clarity. State legislatures met in special sessions, governors calculated party advantage, and lobbyists tracked every wavering vote. Tennessee became decisive because 35 states had already ratified, and one more was required under Article 5. Pro-suffrage and anti-suffrage forces crowded Nashville hotels, circulated telegrams, and pressed legislators through family, party, and patronage channels. Harry Burns' switch under pressure from his mother, Feb Byrne, became famous, but the larger story was procedural. Committee reports, floor calendars, and a single chamber vote determined whether a constitutional amendment would clear the final threshold. Black activists watched that triumph with a harder realism. In the same years that white women entered registration rolls in new numbers, Southern counties retained poll taxes, white primaries, literacy tests, understanding clauses, and discretionary registrar power. Mississippi's 1890 Constitution had already supplied one model for disfranchisement, and Alabama, Louisiana, and other states refined it in the 1890s and early 1900s. The federal amendment changed sex classification on paper, yet county courthouse practice still sorted access to the ballot by race, violence, and local official discretion. When Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment in August 1920, the final language was already doing blunt constitutional work. The vote could not be denied on account of sex. Those 5 words closed one formal gate and forced election administrators, party committees, and registrars to adjust the paperwork of citizenship. Poll books, party machinery, and campaign strategy all had to reckon with a new class of voters protected by national text rather than state discretion. The amendment's silence carried consequences equal to its command. It said nothing about poll taxes, literacy tests, white primaries, registrar intimidation, or racial terror. Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and black club women across the South understood that immediately. A constitutional guarantee aimed at sex left the Jim Crow apparatus intact. County officials in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana could still narrow the electorate through race while claiming formal compliance with the new amendment. The Volstead Act used federal writing in a different register. Congress took the 18th Amendment and translated it into definitions, warrants, seizures, criminal penalties, and enforcement jurisdictions. Dry leaders wanted no ambiguity about what counted as intoxicating liquor, or who would police possession, transport, and manufacture. Once the statute was signed, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, federal courts, Coast Guard crews, customs officers, and local police were pushed into the daily burden of making morality administrative. Set beside both measures, the Niagara Declaration reads like a ledger of claims the national government refused to elevate with equal force. Its demands for voting rights, equal treatment in public accommodations, equal schooling, and impartial law enforcement were written with full knowledge that white officials had built an entire regional order around denial. The words from Niagara were chosen under pressure because they named the exact rights being withheld. Read together the Suffrage Amendment, the Volstead regime, and Niagara's demands expose a state willing to constitutionalize some reforms while leaving black citizenship trapped behind the local machinery of white rule. By the early 1920s, woman suffrage had changed party calculations, expanded reform constituencies, and helped push issues such as education, maternal health, and labor standards more directly into electoral politics. The Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act of 1921 showed how quickly the new electorate could shape legislation. Yet the gain remained uneven because Southern racial barriers still blocked many black women and men from meaningful access to the ballot for decades. Prohibition revealed a different limit. Reformers won a constitutional and statutory victory, but enforcement exposed weak legitimacy, uneven compliance, corruption, and lucrative illegal markets. The Volstead regime built a national policing structure around alcohol, and that structure eventually collapsed into repeal through the 21st Amendment in 1933. The federal government proved it could regulate daily conduct on a vast scale, but not that it could secure lasting consent for doing so. Niagara's influence survived through institutional inheritance rather than immediate statutory victory. The NAACP carried litigation, publicity, and federal lobbying forward, while Du Bois and other activists kept the demand for immediate civil rights alive against delay and accommodation. That continuity preserved a language of equal citizenship that progressivism had not been willing to honor evenly. The unresolved problem sits in the comparison itself. One reform movement widened the electorate, another expanded federal enforcement over private conduct, and a third had to fight just to make the Constitution apply to black citizens on ordinary terms. If that is the record of democratic reform at its height, then the question is not whether progressivism changed the country. The question is why the state moved so quickly for some claims of citizenship and so slowly when equal protection threatened the racial order beneath them.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.